Again, thank you guys for joining us. As we Kipcon is a full service engineering firm. We are mainly known for our reserve studies, which is good for me because that is what I am the head of. But we do all kinds of other things as well. We do specs, bidding, contract admin. We do engineering inspections, third-party inspections, structural inspections, site work inspections. So, yeah, our goal is kind of the way I see it and the way we see it as a company is for the reserve study is kind of the foot in the door, so to speak, because we're coming out to your community and we are inspecting everything basically. Now, cursory observations, of course, we're not, as part of a reserve study, we are not doing any invasive inspections or walk-on roof inspections or anything like that. We certainly can provide those services separately, but as part of a reserve study, that is not what is needed. So yeah, that's kind of what I always like to say, the foot in the door. We see all the various components, even if it's just, to a cursory degree, and that way we can talk about, your pavement or your siding or your roofing or any big ticket project that you may have coming up, that you need help with replacement for, we can certainly do that. And the reserve study is the first step in that process. And then, if you say, hey, our roofs are 20, 25 years old, we're looking to get them replaced soon, our goal is then to become your engineer. We can do the specs for those roofs. We can do the contract administration services for that roof, for those roofs, the bidding services for those roofs to make sure everything is being bid apples to apples, and we can kind of help you through that process. So, again, the reserve study is the first step in that process, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today.
Uh,
So let me see.
you're the host
Sorry.
now, Brandon.
Okay,
You're,
yeah, no problem.
you're
Sorry about the delay. So let's get started here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so again, today we're going to talk about choosing the right reserve study and adequacy. So kind of two different topics, but they kind of blend together. And we'll kind of go through here, and you guys can kind of see what we're talking about. So today's webinar, we will discuss how to choose the right reserve study for your community and how to develop a reserve study funding policy that ensures both adequate funding and minimal risk. This is, as we get towards the end, this is kind of an advanced level presentation. So please feel free, like I said, drop questions in the chat. If you want to save them to ask them yourself at the very end, please do so. And I'm happy to kind of jump back and talk about whatever it is that you want. Because we're kind of going to get into the weeds here near the end as far as some numbers go. But hopefully, I can explain it in a way that you guys can come out of it with some knowledge here. Um, yeah, so again, it's a more advanced session. Happy to answer any questions, but let's, put them in the chat or we'll keep them to the end so we can kind of move this along, efficiently. All right, so very generally, a reserve study is a budget planning tool. That's a very important word, budgetary tool. So keep that in mind. A budget planning tool that identifies the components a community association is responsible for maintaining or replacing, the status of the reserve fund, and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the anticipated future common area expenditures. So the reserve study incorporates all of those things. It has a financial analysis as well as a physical analysis, and we're going to get into that here in a second. So here, very generally, and this is from the CEI standards. This is kind of the 9 steps, to preparing a reserve study from beginning to end. You can kind of see here these three highlighted in red are kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. But in general, the first thing you want to do is establish your components. Obviously, the reserve study is not going to make any sense if we don't include the right components. And again, we're focusing on common elements. So every community association is different. There are not going to be any two associations that have exactly the same common elements or exactly the same quantities, that kind of thing. So, we want to make sure that that's the first step, and we want to make sure that we're starting off with the right information, which, that information comes from, your governing documents, most first and foremost, as well as any information from you guys as a board or management company. So it's kind of, I always like to say this is a collaborative process. Of course, we're doing the work, and we are the client. Excuse me, we are the contractor, but we want to make sure that we're providing a document for you guys to kind of use. And it's the same with any engineering firm. So yeah, we want to establish the components first that are to be included. We want to establish and update the physical attributes and conditions. So the condition assessment, and again, we're going to get into these a little bit more in a second here. But the condition assessment of said components is kind of the next step in the process. And then after that, we're talking about costs. Of course, this is a budgetary tool, so costs are very important. Costs should be with a reserve study. Of course, we want to be as accurate as possible. But again, this is a budgetary document, so it might not be to the penny. But again, we want to be as accurate as possible. So, then the establishing and updating the component useful lives and remaining useful lives, that goes back to the conditions. The remaining useful lives are going to be based on condition of the components that are seen, based on the inspection in the field. So, and also I should say information as far as how, the age of these components, because, you could have roofing or pavement that's 20 years old that it looks like it's still in okay condition. Or you can have roofing or pavement that's 5 years old that kind of looks like it's in not so good condition. So the age of the component is a factor and the condition of the component is a factor. We kind of use both of those pieces of information to kind of come up with a remaining life that is makes sense for that component. And then the next step would be establish a starting reserve fund balance. So, using reserve studies are, we have to pick a point in time for them to start. Usually they would start when the association's fiscal year starts. So we would need that information as far as what should be the starting point in your reserve fund to make sure that we're capturing the most up-to-date information. And then again, this is what we're gonna start to get into today. Evaluate and calculate the reserve fund strength, e.g. percent funded. Establish and confirm the funding methodology and the goal, and establish the multi-year funding plan. And obviously, the last step is preparing the report. So these kind of three highlighted boxes here. That's kind of what we're going to be focusing on moving forward. All right, so with the reserve study, there are kind of 5 parts. We're going to go through those. The first part, again, is the component inventory, which is the task of selecting and quantifying the reserve components. This step may seem silly, but it is crucial because, we want to make sure that we're including the right components and the right quantities, because otherwise, basically, the entire report is going to be null and void. So this task can be accomplished through on-site visual observations, review of design plans and organizational documents, review of association precedents, and discussion with appropriate representatives of the association. As I mentioned earlier, again, this is a collaborative process. We want to make sure that documents are, provided that you guys are going to use. And I'm sure any engineering company would do the same thing. We want to, there are certain standards and things that are used, but if you say, hey, you know what, we actually replace component X every 10 years instead of every 20, that kind of thing. We want to make sure that the report gets adjusted and suited to your specific needs. That's why I said, communities are so different. There's not kind of one boilerplate of what components are included or not included. Every community is different. So that's why we want to make sure we start off on the right foot. So you can see here, this is kind of just a snapshot of one of our reports that lists a couple different components and quantities there. So condition assessment, number 2. The condition assessment is the task of evaluating the current condition of the component based on observed or reported characteristics. The assessment is limited to a visual, non-invasive evaluation. Again, we want to look at everything, but we are not looking at every crack and every broken board on a deck and that kind of thing. So just want to make sure that that's clear. And that's the case with any reserve provider. Again, we can certainly add things like walk-on roof inspection, drone inspections, invasive inspections, but a typical reserve study does not include those things. It's just a normal cursory overview. Excuse me, because again, this is a budgetary tool. It's not meant to be a punch list document to pick up every single deficiency in the community. Um, so number three, life and valuation estimates. So the task of estimating useful life and remaining useful life of the reserve components. So when we're talking about useful life, that is basically the average lifespan of a component when new. So you can see here, typical, asphalt pavement. We use a 20-year useful life for asphalt pavement. That means when it's brand new, it should last about 15 years. Or excuse me, about 20 years. Again, sometimes it may be 15, it may be 25, it's just kind of an average of what we've seen and what the industry standards are. And again, that can always be adjusted. If for whatever reason you're in a community that's, you see your pavement needs to be done every 15 years instead, that can certainly be adjusted. So as a standard, that's kind of what we use. But again, these are kind of up for debate, I would say, to a certain extent. If you were to tell us, hey, you know what, let's put 50 years for the asphalt pavement, that I probably would push back on a little bit. So yeah, so that's kind of the age, the lifespan of a component when new. And then the estimated remaining useful life is basically saying how long until that component will require replacement. So again, these are kind of things where, it's we use our best judgment. We use, again, the age of a component combined with our visual observations. And again, these are, you know, I don't want to call it a guesstimate, but it's our educated opinion as far as what we think the component will last. And again, these can be, these are things that can be adjusted when we meet, and we'll kind of talk about that later on as well. And just to read through the task of estimating the cost to replace, repair, or restore the component to its original functional condition during that particular year, including all related expenses. So that's what the remaining life is, what year that is. Right. So that's number three. Number four, we're going to talk about fund status. So, the basically the fund status is the ratio at a particular point in time that clearly identifies either the beginning balance or end of the associated fiscal year of the actual projected reserve balance to the fully funded balance expressed as a percentage. So again, this is at a point in time, and our report. So this report, let's just say it's 2025 report. So basically, this is saying at this point in time, the association is approximately 65% funded. You can see here that the beginning balance, that's basically how much money you have in your account that's going towards those components, divided by the full funding balance, which is basically saying if you were 100% fully funded at this point in time, how much money should you have? So this association has about 65% of the I'll call it the full funding balance. And a question we get asked often is, well, what percentage should we be at? And my answer to that is there really isn't a set number, just because, again, associations are so different. You could have an HOA with, only some sidewalks and a sign versus a high-rise building that has 200 components. So it's kind of hard to gauge the percent of where you should be among associations. Really, 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 really rough number is, 60% or above is kind of okay. But again, that is not a standard. It's not a requirement. That's just, if I'm pressed to give you an answer, that's what I would say. Um, so yeah, so that just kind of showing you to kind of give you a guideline of where you are versus where you should be 100% fully funded. And again, 100% fully funded is not required. And to be honest, most of the time it's overkill. And we'll kind of talk about that moving forward as well. So yeah, so number five is the funding plan. An association's plan to provide income to a reserve fund to offset anticipated expenditures from that fund. The plan must be a minimum of 30 years of projected income and expenses. So again, you can see here, this is kind of a graph of the report that we were just looking at. And you can see for a number of years you're building up, you drop down, you build up, you drop down. This is probably, a big expenditure like a roof or a road or something like that, or siding. You build up, you spend money, you build. So basically, the goal of this is that you need to just be funded adequately. And again, we're going to get into adequately as we move along here. But you can see over the 30 years, this funding plan never drops below zero, which technically is adequate. So this would suffice, so to speak. Okay,
Sorry,
so
not
now let's
doing
get
videos
into
and
the different types of reserve
that's
studies. There are four
handling
different
now.
types as defined by the national standards. So a full study, sometimes called a full study or a level one, essentially that is if number one, if you've never had a reserve study before, you absolutely have to have a level one study. There's really no debate. And included in that is all five of the things we just talked about: the component inventory, the condition assessment, the life and valuation estimates, the fund status, and the funding plan. And when this is needed, again, a new community to reflect as-built conditions, or when there is a lack of confidence in the existing study. So let's say you had a study done, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it is, you don't feel comfortable in the components or the quantities or the funding plan or whatever the case may be, and you want to just start from scratch. At that point in time, you probably should get a level one study. Again, a level one study is also, we call it a full. Number two, so a level two is called an update with site visit. So that also includes the 5 items that we just talked about. You can see there we kind of match up: component inventory, condition assessment, life and valuation estimates, fund status, and funding plan. Now, this does not require that the quantities are reestablished. Essentially, with a level two study or an update, we would take the quantities from the prior study and carry them through to this study. Now, we would, and they should be kind of verified, I'll say. So as an example, if your engineer is on site and the prior study had 50 streetlights, but you only see 5, that's obviously a problem, and that needs to be adjusted and should be adjusted. But there will not be a requantification of, let's say, the roofing shingles, that kind of thing, because that's kind of hard to tell. And then the other thing are with updates, any components that were not on the previous study that do now fall within the 30-year replacement period should be added. That is crucial because as communities age, so if you're a new community, let's say 5 years old, and you get a reserve study done, that reserve study may not have on there the siding or the block retaining walls, just because those components have such a long useful life. But as you move through into year, 5, 12, 15, those components now are going to fall within the 30-year projection range. So you need to make sure that they're added so that, down the line that these items are picked up and not missed. And the other thing is, on that same note, long life components should be added to the study as well. So let's say you have a block retaining wall that was just replaced, last year. That line item has a 50-year useful life or more. Let's just call it 50 years. That component should be on the reserve study and it should be listed out with a 50-year life, but the cost can be included as zero because it does not fall within the 30-year projection period. So basically, the point of that is so that we're picking it up, we're not missing it, and then moving forward when you get your updates done, once that component falls within the 30-year window, you can say, okay, now we need to add the cost of that into the study. But it's just to make sure that things are not missed moving forward. And for updates, so when they're needed in New Jersey, as I'm sure most of you know, there has been legislation that passed last year that now requires an update to be performed every 5 years. So, and I'll say an update with a site visit to be prepared every 5 years, and I'll get into that in a second here. And again, if you're not happy with your funding plan, you should get a new update. The best practices through CAI is every 3 years. Statutory requirement is every 5. So basically, you should be getting an update with site visit somewhere in that range. Every 3 to 5 years is kind of the recommendation. So yeah. So again, an update because a lot of times I know, and I know Jen will say they'll tell you the same thing. A lot of times we get contacted, hey, we need a new reserve study, and new technically an update is a new reserve study, but when I hear new, I kind of think, okay, we need to start from scratch. So essentially, if you have an update that's been done prior that you're okay with, we can do a new study, but it would be an update technically. So just want to clear up the language there as far as new versus full versus update, because I know sometimes it can get confusing. So a new study can be an update of a prior study, essentially. Okay, so number 3 here. So this is what we call sometimes a paper update. This is a reserve study update that does not include a site visit. So you can see a component inventory and the condition assessment are not included in that because we are not going on site to verify anything. So while the life and valuation estimates, the fund status, and the funding plan are all included, essentially with a paper update, all that would be done is we would obviously update the beginning balance. Your costs would be updated to current dollars, and the years would be subtracted. Let's say it's been 3 years since the previous study. 3 years would be subtracted from every component. Now, keep in mind, a paper update or a level 3 update in New Jersey, they do not meet the legislation. So, as an example, if you had an update done, if you had a reserve study done 3 years ago, and you then want to get a paper update, that is totally fine. But keep in mind that does not meet the requirements of the 5-year update period.
Oh.
You would still need to get your reserve study updated with a site visit in the next 2 years. So, keep that in mind, that paper updates are absolutely something that can be done, but they do not go towards the requirement in New Jersey. And again, they're needed for budgetary purposes, essentially, is the only reason. And then level 4 is essentially for a community that has not been constructed yet. It includes a component inventory. Obviously, there's no condition assessment because the community does not exist. The life and valuation estimates, fund status, and funding plan. And the component inventory is created from either the design plans, well, not either. It is created from the design plans as well as the governing documents of the association if they exist. So, we're kind of just, you're kind of just basing it off of, I don't want to say hypothetical because, the community is going to be built, obviously, but you're basing it off of plans and not an actual community. So that's been constructed. So there's no site visit involved. And that in New Jersey, that is required to be included in your documents that you disclose to the state. So it's basically something that a developer would do as part of their packet that they send to the state to apply to build their community. But yeah, it's something that it's whenever these communities are constructed, at that point in time, there should be an update done as well to make sure that everything was built as per the documents and everything, that all the assumptions that were made are accurate, essentially. So yeah, so that's kind of those are the 4 different types of reserve studies. And then there's also, there's obviously hybrids. Let's say that you want, let's say you have an existing study, but you're kind of unsure of some of the quantities.
Brandon?
You can obviously let your preparer know, hey, can you re-quantify the pavement and the sidewalks, but everything else can just be an update. That's kind of like a hybrid study that we would call. And that, again, that's needed when you have a lack of confidence in portions of the existing study. So if there's only a few things you're unsure of, you just let the preparer know, and I'm sure, those things can be looked at more stringently, I guess. All right, so and updating. So to keep the reserve study current and reflect the ongoing changes to the components and the financial needs of the community, the reserve study should be updated on a regular basis. Best practices is for a site inspection-based reserve study to be at least every 3rd year. Again, that is the best practices. The statutory requirements in New Jersey is every 5 years. So basically, somewhere between 3 and 5 years, you need to get an update done with a site visit. So now adequacy. Adequacy kind of means different things to different people. This is taken from the National Reserve Study Standards from CAI, a replacement reserve fund and stable and equitable multi-year funding plan that together provide for the reliable and timely execution of the association's major repair and replacement projects as defined herein without reliance on additional supplemental funding. So basically that means without special assessments or loans. This may not mean baseline funding. So keep in mind that again, it's a little bit different. The definition is a little bit different through all the different agencies. Excuse me. So this is from the legislation that passed last year in New Jersey. It is very similar, the wording. An association of a planned real estate development shall obtain a reserve study, including a 30-year funding plan, in order to ensure that the association has adequate reserve funds available to repair or replace the capital assets located in the common elements and facilities that the association is obligated to maintain without need to create special assessment or loan obligation. So you can see that that wasn't explicitly defined in the national standards, but that's kind of what it means. Except that in those cases in which a capital asset reaches the end of its established useful life earlier than predicted by the reserve study. Nothing herein is intended to prevent the imposition of assessable assessment or obtaining a loan. So essentially what that means is if the reserve study projected your pay, and I'm just going to pick, your pavement to last 5 years, but you really needed to do it in 2 years, that kind of you can kind of that's kind of an exception to that case basically. Um, all right, so things to consider with adequacy. Again, like I said, not every community is the same. So the number one thing is the age of the community. If you have a community that is only 5 or 10 years old, everything is in good condition, you haven't had to do major replacements, adequacy, you can kind of maybe be a little more liberal with it because you're probably not going to have many replacement items coming up for at least 5, 10, 15 years. Everything is new. You kind of have some time to build up your reserve fund, that kind of thing. However, if you're a 50-year-old high-rise building where everything is kind of aged and needs some TLC, then you kind of need to be a little bit more aggressive with your funding, I'll call it, because you kind of don't have that window anymore where you can kind of build up your reserves. It's kind of you're kind of in the mode now where it's okay, we need to make sure we get up to where we need to be and as quickly as possible. So there are different situations. The review of historical information. So what we mean by that is, again, going back to, let's say your community, for whatever reason, you need to replace your roads more often than you thought. That should be brought up to the reserve provider, because then maybe the reserve study, maybe the useful life gets adjusted for that specific component. Or we've done our roofs more often than we thought, for whatever reason. Maybe that needs to be adjusted in the report. Um, the type of building, another thing that plays into this, like I was talking about earlier. If you have a HOA with no common no amenities, and you only have a couple sidewalks, maybe a sign and some street lights, that's a lot different than a 25-story high-rise building with all kinds of mechanical equipment and facades and roofs and that kind of stuff. So again, not every community is created equally, and not every community should be thought of the same as far as adequacy is concerned. And strength of operating budget, the next one there. Again, we see communities, sometimes they have various line items in the reserve study, or excuse me, in their operating budget for, facade repairs, balcony repairs, concrete repairs every year, which is a good thing. So maybe in those instances, we can be a little bit more conservative with the remaining life of that component. Since we know work is being done, to maintain those items every year, maybe they're going to last a bit longer than we thought. And on the other hand, if no maintenance is being done whatsoever, if there's nothing being put towards those components in the operating budget, any kind of maintenance, whatever you want to call it, then maybe we say, okay, those components are going to not last as long as we thought. So we got to kind of make that adjustment as well. So all that information is important to know. Cost of most expensive component. So what's meant by that is, in an ideal world, you always have at least X, and I'll call it, I'll use roofs as an example. Let's say your roofs are your most expensive component. To replace all the roofs in the community, you're looking at $200,000. What a good barometer is to see that you always have at least that much money in your reserve account. So that way, God forbid, worst case scenario, your roofs fail way earlier than you thought, you can then still do that work. Again, sometimes that is not realistic. It depends on the funding plan, and we'll get into some examples here in a minute. But that is kind of one thing to consider as far as how much of a minimum that you have in your reserve fund balance moving forward. The next thing is we're talking about inclusion of inflationary effects and interest. Inflation on total cost, interest on beginning balance. They don't offset each other. I know Mitch has done some studies on that and run some kind of case studies to see, for example, if you include 2% interest and 2% inflation, do they end up actually offsetting each other in the end? And the answer to that is no. So are they needed? So there's no requirement, either from CAI or New Jersey through the legislation, to include interest and inflation. So as a standard at Kipcon, we do include them in our reports. However, if the association wishes, and to be honest, and I know Mitch has brought this up in his other webinars, if you're getting your report updated every 3 to 5 years, which is now required in New Jersey at least, is it necessary to include inflation and interest? Because those updates are kind of every few years. You're kind of picking up the effects of inflation and interest moving forward. So again, it's totally a decision that the association should make. We can do it, we can remove it. It's a simple process, but it does make a difference as far as your funding plan moving forward. So it's just something to consider. And again, that goes to the risk tolerance. How conservative do you want to be? How aggressive do you want to be? That kind of thing. We can make recommendations, but it's always good to get information from the associations and from the boards to see how they want to handle these things. All right, so now we're going to go into we're going to get into the weeds here a little bit. So I hope you guys can follow along here. We have two different case studies, and this is kind of go towards some of the examples I was talking about. As number one here, we have only a 10-year-old building, so a lot of the items have not been replaced yet. Everything is kind of in newer condition. Not brand new, but newer condition. A 3-story building. So here's a snapshot of what we're looking at here. So basically, this is just a snapshot from our report. We call it the summary page. It basically just summarizes all of the different categories, telling you, how much money you need to replace these items, how much you have in your fund, that kind of thing. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, this association has almost $135,000. The full funding balance, or in other words, how much you should have at this point in time if you were 100% fully funded, is about 64%. Now, again, full funding balance is probably overkill. It's the most conservative method of funding. Most associations don't go with it just because it's kind of not necessary. So just keep in mind that just because you're not fully funding or fully funded, it doesn't mean you're necessarily underfunding. So yeah, this is just a snapshot of the various components here. This is the projection graph moving forward, so you can kind of see it kind of makes sense. It's a 10-year-old building. The first 10, 12 years, there's not really a lot going on. You're kind of just building up your reserve fund. But then after that is when you're going to kind of start to see some drops, and that's because in 20 to 30 years of a building, obviously you're going to need to replace your roofs and your balconies and whatever else there may be. So that's what these drop offs here are, and you can kind of see here in, it looks like year 20, there's a big drop. So there was a big expense in that year, and you drop below zero, which is not good. But we're going to kind of show how we can kind of offset that here in a second. Yeah, so this is kind of the same graph, but this adds in this is just current funding, I should say. This is basically if the association kept funding at their current level for the next 30 years, which obviously we understand that that's not going to be the case most likely, but it's just kind of to give you an example of what would happen. So now this is basically the same graph, but now we've added in full funding, which is the blue, and baseline funding, which is the green. And again, full funding is the most conservative method. It's funding for 100% of the components when the time comes. You can kind of see here though that, over the 30 years, I mean, you're never getting close to running out of money. In fact, you're getting up to almost $700,000 here near the end, which, yes, is that great? Absolutely, it's great. Is it necessary though? And I would argue that it's not, because why fund that much when you don't need to spend that much money? So you can kind of see here the green line, in year 25 or whatever it is, you drop down to zero. That's what baseline funding is. Baseline funding drops the reserve fund balance to zero in one of the corresponding 30 years. So basically, what we're trying to say here with this arrow is you want to be somewhere in this sweet spot. Somewhere between full funding and baseline funding is what almost every association does. So that's where the goal is, and that's where you want to aim to be, because you can see, there's a lot of variance here. In the year 2045, in baseline funding, you're at zero. In full, you're at $400,000. So that's kind of a big area to play with, so to speak. So this is what we call the projection chart. This is basically just it's basically just the numerical version of this. So the columns to focus on here are current funding, which is this association is putting away approximately $20,000 per year. Full funding, which is saying $45,000 per year. That's the blue line on this. If they were to put away $45,000 per year, the blue line would be the corresponding fund balance. And then the last funding analysis is what's called baseline funding. That's 29,000 or almost 30,000 a year. So that would be the green line here. So the difference between funding 45,000 a year and $29,000 a year is basically this huge variance. So you can kind of see there's a lot of wiggle room to play with there. All right, so now we're going to try to we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. At this specific association, the cost of the most expensive component, which is the roof, at this point in time, it's $133,000. That inflated cost would be $165,000 in about 9 years. So again, going back to interest and inflation, is it necessary? Should you include it? It's not required, so it's a decision for your associations to make individually. In this instance, inflation was included. So just wanted to mention that. Threshold funding is kind of what we were talking about, the variance between full and baseline. Somewhere in the middle is threshold funding. So there are a number of ways to do threshold funding or to incorporate it into your funding plan. One of the most popular ways is to include a percentage of the total replacement costs. So this $575,000 number, we'll jump back for a second. You can see that number is taken from here. So the reserve requirement present dollars is essentially the costs to remove and replace every component one time. So if the association had to remove and replace every common element throughout the community, it would cost $575,000. So that's where that number is being pulled from. That also includes unseen components. What we mean by unseen components is typically a contingency is included for things that you cannot see behind the walls or underground. That might be wiring or plumbing or plumbing vents, stacks, underground stormwater systems, that kind of thing. So obviously we can't see those things. It's hard to give a condition assessment of them since we can't see them. So we include contingency for those type of items, and that some kind of money should be included for those items moving forward. So you could see that, again, a percentage threshold, which is a very popular way to come up with a threshold. What that's saying is at 5 and 10% are the most popular. What it's saying is take 10% of this dollar amount, which is, again, the cost to remove and replace everything one time, and set that as the minimum in your fund so that you will never drop below. In this, for 10%, it would be $57,000, and for 5%, it would be $28,000. So it's saying you would never drop below these amounts, and these would be the minimum in your reserve fund. So again, there's no right or wrong or indifferent way to do threshold funding. This is just one method, and it's one of the popular methods that we get requested a lot. So we can see this is kind of this is kind of a recommendation, so to speak. Let's say we had a discussion with the board and the association, and they wanted to cap their increases at 10% a year. They did not want to increase more than 10% a year moving forward. And they also wanted to do, they'll set their update every 3 years, which is, again, the best practices through CAI. And then they're also double funding certain things, which is probably overkill, but it's a good thing. They had a contingency for brick repointing in the reserve study, and I believe they also had money in the operating fund for brick repairs. So they're covering themselves to make sure that the brick is being taken care of, so to speak. So they're kind of being very conservative. Okay, so again, the current conditions, this association is contributing $20,000 per year. Basically, if they were to continue on that route, by 2044 they would be in a deficit of 185,000. By 2054 they would be in a deficit of 286,000, and we'll show that here in a second. You can see 2044, the first year that they go negative, 185,000, and then by the end they're at that 286 number. So with full funding and a 30-year average. So when we're talking about a 30-year average, you can see that all the way down, the full funding number changes every year. 36, then down to 34, then down, 34, 35, 37, it goes up, it goes down. We understand that sometimes it's hard to adjust your contributions every single year. So basically the way to I guess I'll call it offset that is we take a 30-year average. So this column, the $45,000 a year, is an average of this column. So you can see down at the bottom, they basically equal out. So the full funding and 30-year averaging annual contributions, $45,000 a year. The minimum amount in the reserve fund over the 30 years is $171,000, which is right up here. So it's the first year. So you can see that, from year one on, they're just building and building and stacking their reserve fund, which is a good thing. But again, do you always need to have, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 in your reserve fund? Is it great? Yes, of course it's great. Do you need it though, is the question. And the answer is probably no. So baseline funding and 30-year averaging. So the annual contributions for baseline funding in this case is $29,903 per year. Again, that's this set of columns here. And you can see that down here in year, whatever this is, 22 or so, the reserve fund balance hit zero. So essentially this is saying that this association needs to fund at least $29,903 per year in order to break even, so to speak. They're never going to drop to a deficit. And again, we're using information. Again, we understand moving forward that that's not realistic to keep your annual contribution the same every single year, but it's just kind of to give you a gauge of where the funding should be. So, and again, for this association, we 1% interest and 2% inflation was used. So this is again what we were just looking at. So yeah, going back to the graph, the starting point, you want to just take a look at this and see and realize how much of a variance you have here, where you can kind of play with this and get to somewhere in this sweet spot here. And the reason I keep using this as the point of focus is because this is the year that the fund balance drops to zero in 2047. So basically, then the next question becomes, okay, how do we get to a level of funding where we're comfortable? It's basically you would go, and the first thing that was done was interest was removed. Again, no requirement for interest in any of the either the legislation or the CEI standards. So just keep that in mind. Then we were at, only include inflation for components that are to be done within the update period. So basically within the next 3 years, let's only include inflation on those items. And the reason for that is kind of once you get past, 3, 5, 7 years, while the inflation is still factored in, does it really make sense? You're kind of looking at, inflation out, 10, 15 years, and we're kind of getting to numbers that kind of don't make sense. So again, if you're going to get an update done in 3 years anyway, maybe we just include the inflation for those first 3 years, and then after that it drops off. Then the request was, okay, we only want to now see what would happen if we would go up 3% per year. What does that threshold become? So doing it that way, and we'll look at it in the next slide here. Doing it that way, the threshold becomes all the way up to $118,000. So basically, the minimum in the account using these stipulations here is $118,000, which, if you remember, is well above these two numbers that we were talking about earlier, the 5 and 10%. So you can see the percentage of the 118 versus the 576, which we talked about earlier as far as the total replacement dollars. That's all the way up to 20%. So the conclusion is it's totally okay to use this as a funding plan. And kind of here is the results. Essentially we started out with the 20,000 a year, and you increased by 3% a year, which is kind of, not that bad. And you can see that throughout the 30-year projection, the association has more than enough money to do whatever projects that they need. So, and the reason for this is because it's a newer building, so they kind of had some more time to kind of build up to where they need to be, and the increases did not need to be nearly as steep. So that's case study number one. Case study number two is we're going to be going the opposite way. This one is going to be not so pretty. This building is 18 stories. It's about 63 years old, and it was a full study. So the first time they've had a study done. So you can see here, very different, almost 10 times as much money to replace the components as the previous one we were looking at, $5.6 million. The fund balance that this community has was $520,000 versus where they should be, about 1.8 million. So you can see that the percent funded is 28%, which is probably a little low. And we'll see that illustrated better as we move forward here. So this association was putting away $10,000 per year. And again, we'll show that on the next slides here. And here are the full funding and baseline funding contribution amounts. You can see that, it's a heck of a jump there. And you can see if they were to continue funding where they're at, they drop to almost over a $19 million hole. So some work to do for sure at this place. Here is a graph of the reserve fund balance over the 30 years. And you can kind of see that, we're starting off very low and we're just getting worse as we go along. So again, some work to be done here. So here's that same graph with full funding in blue and with baseline funding in green. And again, the goal is always to be somewhere between these two numbers. So you can kind of see it's not as stark as far as the visuals are concerned, but if you look at the dollar amounts, the full funding balance goes up, into the 5 millions versus the baseline here at 0. So it is a smaller delta just based on visuals, but the dollar amounts are a lot more. So here we can see these numbers that we just looked at on the previous slides. So this association is putting away only $10,000 per year. You can kind of see here that a lot of red. So they're going into a deficit, pretty quickly or early on here. So the full funding number is $678,000 a year to get to where they need to be fully funded. And the baseline funding number is $569,000 a year to kind of, I'll call it break even, to make sure they never drop below 0. And so in this association, the cost of the most expensive component was the pool deck. Currently at $800,000, but the inflated cost down the line was $1.2 million. So again, this would be an association where I would recommend maybe we don't include interest and inflation, because it's so far behind that we kind of want to make sure we use every tool at our disposal to kind of get to where you need to be, but still be accurate. So again, the percent of total replacement costs, that 5.6 million, again, the cost to remove and replace everything one time. So based on this building, 10% of that is 562,000. 5% of that is 281,000. An unseen contingency was also included in this study as well, just FYI. All right, so let's see, some trial and error here. So let's say, oh yeah, we only wanted to increase 10% a year, and then get an update every 3 years, and the unseen components are included as well, which is good. So basically what had to be done for this study was we had to start at a little bit higher of a annual contribution, just because starting at $10,000 is it's basically nothing. So in this instance, we started at 100,000 for kind of sake of argument. And they did have a decent number of units. 181 units. So while that is a decent jump initially, it is, it's 180, divide that over 181 units per month. It's really not that big of a deal. So essentially we're starting out at $100,000. And if we see that the deficits in 2038 would be $971,000 already. And by the end of the 30-year projection, we're talking $13 million deficit. And we'll show this in the next slide in a second here. The full funding annual contribution in that instance would be $611,000. And in that instance, the minimum amount in the reserve fund would be $3.1 million. Again, would you love to have $3.1 million? Of course. Is it something that's necessary, and do you need to have that much? No, it's not. So that's why we want to make sure that we're somewhere in between these numbers here. In the baseline funding, we're at 479 a year, and then the minimum threshold would be 0 in year 2049. So that kind of is this is kind of a snapshot of what we're talking about here. You can see that in the full funding scenario, again, you're talking, $5, $6, $7 million down the line. Do you really need that much? So that's why we want to make sure, and this is kind of, again, the same graph as before, just a visual representation. Okay, so first step is, in the back and forth, let's not include interest and only include inflation for the components requiring replacement within the update period, same as previously. So we're only including inflation for 3 years, and then after that, it's kind of, you're going to get an update done anyway, so you could kind of offset that. Let's see what happens with a maximum yearly increase of 10%. What does the threshold become? So the threshold becomes, using a 10% increase, the threshold is still at negative $1 million in 2039. So the conclusion is this is not an acceptable funding plan. And you can kind of see this is the result of what would happen doing the 10% increases. So again, not acceptable. So number two, trial and error number two. Let's not include interest. Let's only include inflation for components requiring replacement within the update period. Let's do the update period every 3 years. Same as previously. Let's determine the maximum yearly increase to reflect that threshold of 10%. So we want to see what we need to be at annually to always have at least that 10% number of the total dollars, which was 5.6 billion. So 10% of that is 562,000. The funding result in that instance would be increased by 11% per year, and then have a minimum threshold of 542,000, which again, these should not be thought of as hard and fast deadlines, so to speak. For all intents and purposes, this is within, a couple percent of this, so it's acceptable. So we can see here, we have another option. We set it, same thing, only include inflation for components requiring replacement within the update period. Let's see what would happen if we did a 2% increase per year. And if we did a 2% increase per year for 7 years, and then from 2 to 16% after that. In that instance, the minimum threshold would be $336,000, which is 6% of the total. So again, it's between the 5 and 10%. So this option one, which is what we talked about, the 11% increase per year. That's kind of what we end up at. So you can see they start out at 100,000, and then 111, 123, so forth and so forth down the line. And in doing it this way, the minimum dollar amount that they'll have is $542,000, which is in line with that 10% that we talked about earlier. And again, the reasons for this is the age of the building, the type of the building. Historical information. It could have been a new board. It was their first study. All different kinds of things. There's a lot of reasons why their underfunding may have been happening, but our goal as the contractor is to get you to a level that's acceptable now and moving forward. So that was the plan that was settled on, was 11% increases per year all the way down the line. Obviously, there will be another update at some point in this range here, and then you can kind of reassess where the numbers are at that point in time. And this is kind of the accepted funding plan as far as what the fund balance looks like. And you can see that we're above zero all the way through. What not to do. So real quick, a lot of the banking company, Fannie Mae, mortgage companies, they use a 10% of your annual budget is how much you should be putting away towards reserves. Now, that number, again, as we discussed earlier, associations are so different that using just a broad 10% of your operating budget is kind of foolish. It does not evaluate how much money you have. It does not connect to the physical assets. Again, whether you have a handful of components or 200 components, it's a very different situation. It does not relate to the common elements. You should confirm this as a minimum again, but that doesn't mean you absolutely have to use it. And it's kind of more important to get a reserve study done that looks at all these things. And if you're around that 10% number with the reserve study done, totally fine and acceptable, because at least then you have backup for it. All right, so how to get there? This is kind of what you should be asking for in your reserve studies. The report should include full and baseline funding models, as well as a projection of the current funding plan. All plans will include an estimated inflation. Again, inflation and interest, we include it as a standard, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be included. And different rates can be included as well. It doesn't have to be 2% interest, 2% inflation and 1% interest. It could be whatever you guys are seeing on your money. If you're getting 3%, 5%, whatever it is, we can plug that in as well. If it is determined that the current reserve funding is adequate based on the New Jersey legislative requirements and the minimum threshold is less than 5% of the total replacement costs, Kipcon will also include a proposed threshold funding plan as with 5% as a replacement minimum. So that's kind of what we were showing earlier with the 5 and 10% dollar amounts. And again, this bottom part in the red is very important. It is recommended the association meet with Kipcon to finalize the proposed plans prior to proceeding. The reason for that is, there are a million ways to skin a cat. You can do 20% increases for 5 years. You can do 5% increases for 20 years, 10% for 10 years. There are a number of different ways, and there's no right or wrong answer to get to the end goal. But we want to make sure that we're doing something for your community that you can use and that's acceptable to you. And your residents better than we do. Maybe you guys would rather take the brunt of the hit up front. Maybe you'd rather stretch it out over a long period of time. So that's why meeting is so important, to make sure that we can produce a document that you use and that's helpful to you as a reserve study, while also meeting legislative requirements. And here's kind of this is a snapshot from our proposal. It's kind of all the information that we request. So if you've seen one of our proposals, you've seen this at the back. We request that how much you have in your fund, how much you're putting away per year, rates that you want to use if it's different than 2 or 1%. Information. Number 6 is probably the most important. Information as far as work that has been performed over the past few years, because again, we can look at components and give our best judgment on them, but it's always important to know when things were replaced and for how much, so that we can make sure we're getting things the most correct way, I should say. All right, so I know I just talked a lot. So I'm going to open it up now, and for questions. I don't know, Jen, is there any questions in the chat, or if anybody wants to jump in and ask questions, to me, I'm happy to help as best I can.
We have some in the chat. Let me just scroll up. So the first was from Kimberly, who asked, "Does asphalt pavement need complete replacement?" I don't know.
So with pavement, typically what is normally included is a mill and overlay. In our reserve studies, at least, you can mill down and then just overlay 2 inches. Now with that, there are likely going to be areas that do require full depth replacement, as far as going all the way down to the stone and rebuilding the base course. But again, sometimes that's tough to gauge until the milling is done. So typically what's done is a percentage for things like full depth, localized full depth replacement is included in the cost because you don't need to fully rebuild and rebuild and repave your pavement. It's usually a mill and overlay is acceptable.
Next question from Brian. Did the governor sign the amendment to the New Jersey structural law? What is in the amendment?
No, that has not been, so it has not been signed yet. So it is not officially a law, I guess, or legislate, whatever you want to call it. What's in it is essentially a lot of the stuff we just talked about. It basically says that a baseline funding plan now needs to be included in the reserve study. As well as, let me see, I actually have it up here, so we can just
Are we
pull it up
talking
real
about
quick.
structural integrity?
Well, the Structural Integrity Act, there's been I'll call it amendment to it that has passed through the assembly, but it has not been signed yet by the governor.
Okay.
So it's
So
not
still the
it's not in
states in
effect yet, but
January,
it's
right?
coming.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me let's see. Let me share again real quick. Here we go. Just real quick. We don't have to read the whole thing, but so this is what's it was passed through the House a couple months ago, but it is not a law yet. So essentially, it says the bill requires a proposed 30-year capital reserve funding plan to allow a capital reserve fund of an association to reach a dollar balance of zero during the full funding projection. So it's basically permitting baseline funding, and it's also further to that it allows down here, it allows an association to fund at 85% of the reserve, excuse me, an amount of 85% of one of the association's reserve funding plans. So essentially it's saying that for 5 years you can fund baseline 85% of baseline funding. So it's basically loosening the restrictions a little bit. But you can see here, if the association chooses to fund the reserve fund in an amount equal to 85% of the association's reserve funding plan, they must provide certain notice to the unit owners and provide the year in which a special assessment or loan is anticipated as a result of the reduced funding. So you're allowed to do it, but after those 5 years, you kind of have to make that money up somehow. So again, it's not an ideal scenario, but it is something that will be allowed, so to speak. But yeah, this has not been put into law yet, so it is not a requirement yet, but it is coming.
Okay. Next question. Kimberly wants to know, I guess since you spoke about inflation, will tariffs impact adequacy and the reserve fund?
Um, it's hard to tell. I mean, I would imagine yes, but that's kind of not our area of expertise. So I don't want to comment too much on it. But if I had to guess, I would say yes, just because it's affecting other aspects of our day-to-day life. So if I had to guess, I would say yes. But again, we're not economists, so I don't want to speak too much to that either way.
Okay. Next from Lorraine. Just using intuition here, but no one would assume that funding, for example, 30,000 a year over 30 years makes any sense. Wouldn't there logically be an increase in funding over the years, and that would be built into the program from the start? I assume 30,000 would be a minuscule amount in 30 years.
Yeah, for sure. As far as the current funding goes, yeah, we can certainly show, if you tell us, hey, we let's show 30,000 for a few years, then bump it to 40, then bump it to 50, whatever the case may be, as far as current funding goes, that can be shown either way. We wouldn't make an assumption on that because it's kind of arbitrary. But if you tell us, hey, do it this way, show it this way, X percent increases a year, we can certainly show it that way for sure. And it probably does make more sense to do it that way.
Okay. Next from Mary Jane. Why are special assessments not the preferred way to fund a reserve fund deficit? Our owners have stated that they prefer special assessments over large increases in the monthly fee. And then her follow-up is, must reserve study info be disclosed to potential buyers?
So the first part of that, that is we as a reserve prepare company are never going to recommend special assessments. Now, if that's how your community operates, that is totally your prerogative. But what I would say to that is, what if you have a large turnover in 5 years and then you don't have any money and your new owners don't want to do it that way anymore? So, it's kind of, I understand it, and I understand that this legislation is kind of tough for a lot of communities, especially smaller buildings and smaller communities that maybe have not been following reserves for a while. But it's not the preferred method to do things because you never know what's going to happen. Yeah, maybe people like doing it that way now, but in a week or so, maybe they change their mind, and it's kind of hard to base things on, well, maybe we'll get this money. So that's why we as a preparer, and I'm sure most reserve study preparers as well, you don't really want to go down that route if you can at all help it. And what was the second part? I forgot.
Does the reserve study need to be shared with potential buyers?
Oh, you're not legally required to share it, as far as I know. But I mean, if I always tell my friends and family, if you're moving into an association, you probably should ask to see it, because you can see some of these things. But no, you're not, as far as I know, you are not legally required to disclose that document.
Okay. And then question from Mo. Hey Mo. Can we share the deck? So the presentation will be shared with the credits and the certificates.
Awesome.
Yeah, Jen will send that out after we're done here for sure.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And then
You can't retain everything that's on it. So I took
No,
notes, but
listen,
I'm like, we need
Mo,
it.
I understand. It's even hard for me reading it, so I get it.
Yes. And we're almost done with the reserve study. Thank you.
Yes, we are. Yeah, Taylor's
is
working hard
fantastic.
for you guys.
Taylor is fantastic, by the way.
Glad to hear it.
last question from Ellen. Can a loan be obtained or a special assessment if the reserve study line item was not estimated correctly? I.e. reserve study says roof is 1 million and the lowest cost received is 1.5.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want, and I don't want it to mean loan. You cannot get loans. Of course, that is still a viable option. It's just not something that's recommended. Of course, as reserve study preparers, we aim to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes, using that instance, you have to pull $400,000 from somewhere. And yeah, in that instance, it is a viable option. Of course, we don't want to recommend that, and we don't want that to be like a long-term funding option, but you certainly can go that route. It's not to say you cannot do it. That's not what I meant to say.
And one more question from Tom. What do you say to board members who think we are too small for a reserve study, 60 units townhomes?
Well, what I would say is, if Tom, if your community is in New Jersey, then you don't have a choice, unfortunately.
Well, we're in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Well, in that instance, I mean, yeah, there are no statutory requirements in Pennsylvania, at least not yet. I would suggest that my answer to that would be, what are you basing your reserve funding on, if not a reserve study?
They're saying that they're just taking things as they come. It's worked up until now, and but the community's 25 years old now.
Sure.
And nobody can tell us why our dues are what they are. It's just based the budget. They just based the budget on last year.
Well, that's
it.
the thing. Like, yeah, and not to trivialize it, but like, we have no skin in the game, so to speak. We come in, and any engineer will tell you the same thing. We're going to give you the information, and it is what it is at the end of the day. And it's based on our knowledge, our historical data, the current cost, that kind of thing. So you can go and you can point to it and say, okay, this is what we're basing it on. But yeah, just kind of, we pulled it out of a hat, or we know a guy, we get that all the time. We do. And,
Right.
I unfortunately, I can't convince people to do it one way or the other, but I would strongly suggest that, especially a community that's 25 years old. I mean, and I don't know the specifics, but I'm sure you probably had to do your roads, maybe your roofs. I don't know if you have any amenities, siding, that kind of thing, but these are big ticket items. So you want to make sure that you have this money. And, I would say 60, if you said 5 units, we don't have many common elements, whatever, that's a different story. But 60 units is a pretty decent sized community, to be honest with you.
Well, the problem is most of the upkeep on the homes, the siding and the roofs are the unit owner's responsibility.
Ah, gotcha. Okay. All right. So yeah, I mean, so there are limited common elements then it seems.
But
A
we have a
limited number.
swimming pool and a playground and a clubhouse and a gym, and
Okay.
there's still a lot of things there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where, like I said, you want to make sure that you don't want to say, okay, we have no money and now we need to replace everything in the clubhouse. And I'm being, dramatic there, of course, but
Yeah.
it's a budgetary tool, and I think I saw a question of how much does a reserve study cost. This
Mhm.
could kind of tie into that. I mean, obviously it depends on the size of your community and that kind of thing. I would say typically for, a 60 unit townhome community, I don't know, in the $4,000 to $7,000 range, something like that, obviously very, very broad.
Yeah.
But is it worth spending that to make sure that you're putting away enough rather than hit everybody with a $10,000 special assessment? To me, that's
Right.
money well spent. So, yeah. So again, because I did see that question pop up. It all depends. The cost of a reserve study, it could vary from 2,500 to we're doing a reserve study at Mo's building, and it's we're talking $15,000 to $20,000 because there's so much going on there. So there is a big variance, but normally I would say in the $4,000 to $6,000 range, somewhere in that ballpark.
No, based on what I sent you, we it was more than that.
Okay. Yeah. So
Okay.
but that's, for a I'll call it a typical average size community. It's usually in that range. Again, there's variables that go along with it. So it varies, but to me, I would think it would be better to spend the money on that rather than, ask everybody to write a check for $5,000 or whatever the case may be.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you all. I appreciate, you taking the time out to join us today.
Brandon, can I ask you something, please?
Of course.
Yeah, we're a client. We have 6 condo buildings and 300 homes. Our condo building roofs are about 12 to 15 years old. We just had them inspected.
Okay.
Of course, the roofer says, "Oh, you got 1 year, 2 years life left." A lot
Okay.
of roofers are going to tell you that, and I understand get multiple inspections. But do you guys offer any type of inspections, or can
We
you?
do. For sure,
Okay.
yeah. We can do a couple different things. We can do walk-on inspections, where we actually get on the buildings. Those are going to be a little bit more expensive, obviously, because they take time. But we
Mhm.
also offer drone services where we can do kind of a drone flyover and get imagery of the roofs that way.
Mhm.
So there are different ways to go about it. We can kind of do a hybrid of the two, but yeah, absolutely, we can definitely help you there. And if you'd like a proposal, reach out to Jen or myself, and we're happy to help you.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll do that. I mean, I'm not, it's hard to trust some people, of course,
No,
today.
I understand. Listen, a roofing contractor, you never know. Are they just saying that because they want the business,
Right.
or whereas us as an engineering firm, I'm kidding, of course, but like I don't care if you do your roofs or don't do your roofs. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
we're just kind of giving you the information, and you guys take it for what you need. Take it for what it is, and a roofer may have some ulterior motives. You never know.
Right. And I know we should be considering preventative maintenance stuff too, new boots
For
around the
sure.
pipes and caulking and all that. So,
For sure, yeah. Caulking, the gutter should be cleaned every year.
right.
Yeah, definitely, maintenance is imperative to extending the life of reserve components. That's what we always tell people. If you spend a
Right.
little bit of money on maintenance, you might be able to push the life of things off 3, 5, 7 years.
Right. Because this will certainly increase our deficiency if we move up that replacement by
For
5,
sure,
7,
yeah.
8 years. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, typically roofs should last. We use 25 as useful life, so I mean, you guys
Right.
are only about halfway through that. So yeah, that's a big impact for sure.
Okay. I'll reach out to you. Thank you.
Great, no problem.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank
Of
you.
course.
And I just put my email and Brandon's in the chat. So questions, proposal requests, anything you guys need, you can follow up with us.
Thank
Awesome.
you. Thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot.
everybody.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Appreciate it.
Good job.
All right.
Thank you.
Nice work, Brandon.
Why is this not? Oh, there we go.